The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain as Captain Sarah Martinez adjusted her radio headset for the third time in 10 minutes. Something felt wrong. The static-filled reports coming from Forward Operating Base Delta had been getting shorter and more desperate throughout the night. What started as routine patrol updates had turned into frantic calls for backup that suddenly went silent at 0347 hours. Sarah had been flying rescue missions for 8 years, but she had never heard the kind of fear in a Marine's voice that came through her speakers just before the communications went dead. Staff Sergeant Williams, a 20-year veteran known for his steady nerves, had whispered his final transmission with a trembling voice that spoke of something far worse than enemy contact. The command center buzzed with nervous energy as officers huddled around maps and computer screens. Colonel Thompson, a man whose gray hair had turned white during his 3 tours in the region, paced behind the radio operators with his jaw clenched tight. He had sent those 340 Marines on what should have been a straightforward reconnaissance mission to establish a temporary observation post in the mountains. Intelligence reports had indicated minimal enemy presence in the area. Sarah watched as the colonel's aide approached with a fresh stack of reconnaissance photos. The satellite images showed something that made everyone in the room go quiet. What had been an empty valley just 48 hours earlier was now filled with vehicles, tents, and movement patterns that suggested a massive enemy force had moved in overnight. The Marines were not just facing a small patrol or even a company-sized unit. They were surrounded by what appeared to be an entire enemy battalion, possibly more. The radio crackled to life one more time, and Williams's voice came through weak and broken. He reported that they had taken heavy casualties during the night and were completely cut off. Their ammunition was running low, and several Marines were badly wounded with no way to evacuate them. The enemy had positioned themselves on all the high ground around the Marines' position, turning what should have been a defensive advantage into a deadly trap. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she listened to the desperate situation unfolding. The Marines were trapped in a small depression surrounded by steep hills on 3 sides and a cliff face on the 4th. There was nowhere to run, and with enemy forces controlling all the surrounding terrain, any rescue attempt would face devastating fire from multiple directions. Colonel Thompson tried repeatedly to raise other units on the radio, hoping to coordinate a ground rescue mission. But every response came back negative. The nearest friendly forces were more than 50 miles away and would take at least 12 hours to reach the trapped Marines through hostile territory. Other helicopter units were either committed to ongoing operations or grounded due to maintenance issues. As the morning wore on, the situation became increasingly desperate. Intercepted enemy communications revealed that the opposing force was planning a final assault for sunset. They wanted to eliminate the Marine observation post before it could call in artillery strikes on their positions. The enemy commander was quoted as saying he wanted to make an example of the American unit to demoralize other coalition forces in the region. Sarah studied the tactical maps spread across the table, tracing possible flight paths with her finger. Every route to the Marines' position passed directly over enemy-controlled territory, where surface-to-air missiles and heavy machine guns waited. Standard military doctrine clearly stated that no rescue mission should be attempted without adequate escort aircraft and suppression of enemy air defenses. But with no other assets available, following proper procedures meant abandoning 340 Marines to certain death. The weight of the situation pressed down on everyone in the command center. These were not just numbers on a casualty report. Many of the trapped Marines were young men barely out of high school who had joined the service to serve their country. Others were experienced veterans with families waiting for them back home. Sergeant Williams had shown Sarah pictures of his twin daughters just last week, proudly telling her about their high school graduation. As afternoon approached, Sarah made a decision that would change her life forever. She quietly walked to the aircraft maintenance hangar, where her helicopter sat waiting for its next scheduled mission. Chief Warrant Officer Mike Rodriguez, her usual co-pilot, was running through pre-flight checks when she approached. Without explaining the full situation, she asked if the aircraft was ready for immediate departure. Rodriguez could see the determination in Sarah's eyes and nodded without asking questions. He had flown enough missions with her to trust her judgment completely. Together they began preparing the helicopter for what they both knew would be the most dangerous mission of their careers. Sarah's hands moved automatically through the familiar checklist, but her mind was focused on the tactical challenges ahead. The enemy had positioned their anti-aircraft weapons specifically to prevent any rescue attempts. Flying low would expose them to small arms fire and rocket-propelled grenades from the surrounding hills. Flying high would make them an easy target for the shoulder-fired missiles that intelligence reports had confirmed in the area. The fuel calculations were equally troubling. The distance to the Marines' position was at the extreme range of her helicopter's capabilities. If they encountered any delays or had to take evasive action, they might not have enough fuel to return to base. The weight of additional passengers would make the situation even more critical, forcing difficult decisions about who could be rescued on each trip. As Sarah completed her preparations, she thought about the military regulations she was about to violate. Unauthorized missions were strictly forbidden, and attempting a rescue without proper support could result in court-martial proceedings. Her career, which she had built through years of dedicated service and countless successful missions, could end in disgrace. But as she closed her eyes and imagined those 340 Marines waiting for help that was never going to come through official channels, she knew she had no choice. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Sarah made her final decision. Time was running out for the trapped Marines, and every minute of delay reduced their chances of survival. She climbed into the pilot's seat and began the engine startup sequence, knowing that once she lifted off, there would be no turning back from the most important mission of her life. The helicopter blades cut through the afternoon air as Sarah lifted off from the base without authorization. Her radio remained deliberately silent as she knew that any communication with the command center would result in immediate orders to return. Chief Warrant Officer Rodriguez sat beside her, checking and rechecking their navigation equipment while keeping a watchful eye on the fuel gauges that would determine whether they lived or died in the next few hours. The landscape below changed from the familiar territory around their base to increasingly hostile terrain. Sarah flew at extremely low altitude, using the natural contours of the land to mask their approach from enemy radar systems. The helicopter skimmed just above treetops and followed narrow valleys wherever possible, making their flight path longer, but hopefully keeping them hidden from the surface-to-air missile sites that intelligence had identified throughout the region. Rodriguez monitored the radio frequencies, listening to the increasingly desperate communications from the trapped Marines. Staff Sergeant Williams was still alive and trying to coordinate his men's defense, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Several Marines had been killed during probing attacks throughout the day, and ammunition supplies were nearly exhausted. Medical supplies had run out hours earlier, leaving the wounded Marines to suffer without proper treatment. The enemy forces surrounding the Marines had been systematically tightening their grip throughout the day. They had moved heavy weapons into position on the surrounding hills and were using the afternoon hours to coordinate their final assault. Intercepted communications revealed that the enemy commander planned to attack from 3 directions simultaneously at sunset, overwhelming the Marines' defensive positions through sheer numbers and superior firepower. Sarah's helicopter passed through a narrow mountain valley where the sound of their rotor blades echoed off the rocky walls. She knew that this acoustic signature could give away their position to any enemy forces in the area, but there was no alternative route that would get them to the Marines in time. Every minute counted now as the sun continued its steady descent toward the western mountains. As they approached the operational area, Rodriguez spotted the first signs of enemy activity. Vehicle tracks crisscrossed the terrain below, and several temporary camps were visible in clearings between the trees. The enemy force was even larger than intelligence estimates had suggested, with hundreds of fighters positioned throughout the surrounding hills. Sarah realized that they were flying into what amounted to a heavily defended enemy stronghold. The radio crackled with Williams' voice, reporting that enemy forces were beginning to move into assault positions. He estimated that the final attack would begin within the next hour, and his Marines had perhaps 20 minutes of ammunition remaining for their defensive positions. Several wounded Marines were unable to fight, reducing the effective strength of the unit to fewer than 200 men capable of returning fire. Sarah began her descent toward the Marines' position, using a steep approach that would minimize their exposure time to enemy fire. The helicopter dropped rapidly through the mountain air, while Rodriguez called out altitude readings and obstacle warnings. Through the aircraft windows, They could see muzzle flashes from the surrounding hills as enemy forces began their preliminary bombardment of the Marine positions. The landing zone was smaller than Sarah had hoped. The Marines had carved out a small clearing in the center of their defensive perimeter, but it was barely large enough for a single helicopter. Worse, the surrounding terrain was completely exposed to enemy observation and fire from multiple directions. Any aircraft on the ground would be an easy target for the enemy weapons positioned on the commanding heights around the position. As Sarah brought the helicopter in for landing, the first enemy rounds began impacting around the aircraft. Rifle bullets cracked through the air while heavier machine gun fire kicked up clouds of dirt and rocks around the landing zone. Rodriguez called out the locations of muzzle flashes as enemy fighters opened fire from concealed positions throughout the surrounding hills. The helicopter touched down hard on the rocky ground, and immediately Marines began running toward the aircraft. Sarah could see the exhaustion and desperation in their faces as they carried wounded comrades toward the helicopter. Many of the Marines showed signs of the brutal fighting they had endured throughout the day, with torn uniforms, bandaged wounds, and the hollow eyes of men who had been pushed beyond their limits. Staff Sergeant Williams appeared at Sarah's window, shouting over the noise of the engine and incoming fire. He reported that they had 18 critically wounded Marines who needed immediate evacuation, but Sarah quickly realized that her helicopter could only carry 12 passengers on a single trip due to weight and space limitations. The terrible mathematics of the rescue operation meant that some Marines would have to wait. For a second trip that might never come, the enemy fire was intensifying. As more fighters spotted the helicopter on the ground, rocket-propelled grenades began exploding around the landing zone, and Sarah knew they had only minutes before the aircraft would be destroyed or damaged beyond repair. She made the agonizing decision to take the most critically wounded Marines first, knowing that this choice might doom the others to death or capture. Rodriguez helped load the wounded Marines into the helicopter while Sarah kept the engines running and monitored the tactical radio frequencies. The enemy was coordinating their fire and beginning to move assault teams closer to the Marine perimeter. She could hear Williams on the radio trying to direct his remaining men in defending the landing zone, while the evacuation continued. As the last wounded Marine was loaded aboard, Williams grabbed Sarah's arm and looked directly into her eyes. He pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand and shouted that it contained the names and home addresses of all the Marines still on the ground. He wanted to make sure that their families would know what happened if the rescue mission failed and the position was overrun. Sarah felt the weight of that responsibility as she prepared for takeoff. The helicopter was now carrying 12 wounded Marines who desperately needed medical attention, but leaving meant abandoning more than 300 of their comrades to almost certain death. The enemy assault was beginning in earnest, with sustained automatic weapons fire and explosions coming from multiple directions around the Marine perimeter. The aircraft lifted off under heavy fire, with several bullets striking the fuselage and one round cracking the cockpit windshield. Sarah fought to control the helicopter as she climbed rapidly away from the landing zone, knowing that every second in the air above the position increased their chances of being shot down. Behind them, the Marines who remained on the ground continued their desperate defense against overwhelming odds, buying time for their wounded brothers to reach safety, while knowing that help might not return for them. The flight back to base became a race against time and fuel consumption, as Sarah pushed her helicopter to its maximum speed while carrying the wounded Marines. The aircraft shuddered under the strain of the additional weight and the damage from enemy fire, but Rodriguez worked frantically to keep all systems operational. Behind them in the passenger compartment, 12 Marines lay in various states of consciousness, some calling out for their mothers while others maintained the stoic silence of professional soldiers, even in their pain. Rodriguez monitored the radio traffic from the Marine position, relaying updates to Sarah as she focused on flying the damaged aircraft. Williams was still alive and coordinating the defense, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The enemy had overrun one corner of the perimeter and was now fighting the Marines at close quarters with grenades and small arms. The sound of explosions and automatic weapons fire carried clearly through the radio, painting a desperate picture of men fighting for their lives with diminishing resources. The fuel gauge showed dangerously low levels as they approached their base, forcing Sarah to make critical calculations about whether they would have enough fuel for a return trip. The additional weight of the wounded Marines and the high-speed flight had consumed more fuel than planned, and the aircraft would need refueling before any subsequent rescue mission. Every minute spent on the ground at base meant the trapped Marines had less time before the enemy completely overran their position. As the base came into view, Sarah could see emergency vehicles and medical personnel already positioned near the landing pad. Word of her unauthorized mission had clearly reached the command center, and she knew she would face serious consequences for violating direct orders. But the sight of ambulances waiting to receive the wounded Marines reinforced her conviction that she had made the right choice, regardless of the personal cost to her military career. The helicopter landed hard on the medical evacuation pad, and immediately corpsmen and doctors swarmed the aircraft to begin treating the wounded Marines. Sarah watched through her side window as stretchers carried young men who had been fighting for their lives just an hour earlier toward the waiting ambulances. Some of the Marines were conscious enough to give her a thumbs up or a weak smile as they were carried past. Small gestures that meant everything to a pilot who had risked her life to save them. Colonel Thompson appeared at Sarah's door before she had even shut down the engines. His face showed a mixture of anger and grudging respect as he realized what she had accomplished. He ordered her to report to his office immediately, but Sarah refused to leave her aircraft until it was refueled and ready for another mission. She explained that more than 300 Marines were still trapped and that time was running out for any rescue attempt. The colonel's expression changed as Sarah showed him the piece of paper that Williams had given her with the names and addresses of the trapped Marines. Reading through the list of young men who would likely die within the next few hours brought home the human cost of following military regulations versus taking action to save lives. Thompson found himself facing the same impossible choice that had driven Sarah to launch her unauthorized mission. Rodriguez had already begun coordinating with the maintenance crew to repair the battle, damage and refuel the helicopter. Several bullet holes needed to be patched, and the cracked windshield would have to be replaced before they could safely fly another mission. But the most critical issue was the fuel situation, and the weight calculations for carrying more passengers on subsequent trips. The radio in the command center provided a constant stream of updates from the Marine position, each report more desperate than the last. Williams reported that they were down to their last few magazines of ammunition, and that the enemy was preparing for a final assault from all directions. Several more Marines had been killed during the fighting, and the wounded who remained had no medical supplies or treatment available. Sarah studied the tactical maps while her helicopter was being serviced, calculating flight times and fuel requirements for multiple trips. Even if everything went perfectly, she would need at least 6 more flights to evacuate all the remaining Marines. But each subsequent trip would be more dangerous as the enemy adjusted their defensive positions and concentrated their fire on the landing zone, though intelligence reports painted an even grimmer picture of the situation. Enemy reinforcements were arriving in the area, bringing additional heavy weapons and surface-to-air missile systems. The window of opportunity for helicopter rescues was closing rapidly as the enemy strengthened their anti-aircraft defenses around the Marine position. Colonel Thompson made a decision that surprised everyone in the command center. Instead of court-martialing Sarah for her unauthorized mission, he officially authorized continued rescue operations under his direct command authority. This decision violated several levels of military protocol and would likely end his own career. But he could not justify abandoning 300 Marines when a rescue was still possible. The maintenance crew worked with extraordinary speed to prepare the helicopter for its second mission. Patches covered the bullet holes and a new windshield was installed while fuel trucks topped off the aircraft's tanks. Rodriguez conducted a thorough inspection of all critical systems while Sarah reviewed the latest intelligence updates about enemy positions and movements. Word of the rescue mission had spread throughout the base, and off-duty personnel volunteered to help with aircraft maintenance, medical preparations, and logistical support. The entire base community rallied around the effort to save the trapped Marines, with everyone understanding that their own friends and colleagues were fighting for their lives in those distant mountains. As Sarah prepared for her second flight, she received a radio transmission from Williams that changed everything. He reported that the enemy had brought up heavy mortars and was beginning a sustained bombardment of the Marine position. The landing zone had been hit several times and it was now partially blocked by craters and debris. Any helicopter attempting to land would face not only small arms fire and rockets, but also indirect fire from mortars positioned several miles away. The tactical situation had shifted from difficult to nearly impossible, but Sarah knew that abandoning the rescue effort now would condemn more than 300 Marines to death or capture. As she climbed back into the pilot's seat for her second unauthorized mission, she understood that the odds of survival for both the trapped Marines and her own crew were dropping with each passing minute. But somewhere in those mountains, young Americans were counting on her to come back for them, and she had never abandoned a mission in her 8 years of military service. The sun was now low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the base as Sarah lifted off for what everyone knew might be her final flight. Behind her, Colonel Thompson stood watching from the command center window, knowing that he had just authorized a mission that violated every safety protocol in the military manual, but represented the highest ideals of the service he had devoted his life to. The second flight into enemy territory proved even more treacherous than the first, as Sarah navigated through a landscape now fully alert to her presence. Enemy forces had repositioned their anti-aircraft weapons along her previous route, forcing her to take a longer path through even more dangerous terrain. The helicopter flew between mountain peaks under constant threat of surface-to-air missiles, while Rodriguez monitored multiple radio frequencies for any sign that they had been detected by enemy radar systems. The radio reports from the Marine position painted a picture of desperate men making their final stand. Williams's voice had grown hoarse from shouting orders over the sound of explosions and gunfire, but he continued to coordinate his Marines' defense with the professionalism that had made him a respected leader. The enemy mortar bombardment was systematically destroying the Marines' defensive positions, forcing them to abandon their prepared fighting holes and seek whatever cover they could find in the rocky terrain. As Sarah approached the target area, she could see the smoke and fire from the ongoing battle several miles away. The enemy forces had illuminated the Marine position with flares, turning the night battlefield into a hellish landscape of shadows and explosions. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the darkness like deadly fireworks, while the distinctive sound of American M16 rifles became increasingly sporadic as ammunition ran low. The landing zone that had been barely adequate during the first rescue was now a cratered moonscape from mortar impacts. Several large holes and piles of debris made it impossible for Sarah to land in the same location, forcing her to find an alternative site under fire. Williams directed her to a small clearing about 200 meters from the Marine perimeter, but reaching it would require the wounded Marines to cross open ground under heavy enemy fire. Sarah brought her helicopter down fast and hard, using a combat landing technique that minimized their exposure time but put tremendous stress on the aircraft structure. The moment they touched down, enemy fire erupted from multiple directions as fighters who had been waiting in ambush opened up with everything they had. Machine gun bullets sparked off the helicopters, armor plating, while rocket-propelled grenades exploded close, enough to shake the entire aircraft. Rodriguez immediately began returning fire with the helicopter's door-mounted machine gun, trying to suppress the closest enemy positions, while Marines ran across the open ground toward the aircraft. Sarah watched in horror as several Marines fell during the dash to safety, cut down by accurate enemy fire before they could reach the helicopter. Other Marines stopped to help their wounded comrades, creating a chaotic scene of courage and sacrifice in the middle of a deadly firefight. Staff Sergeant Williams appeared through the smoke and confusion, half carrying a wounded Marine while directing other survivors toward the helicopter. His uniform was torn and bloody, and Sarah could see that he had been wounded in the leg, but he continued to function as a leader even under these impossible circumstances. He shouted over the noise that they had lost contact with 2 squads of Marines, who had been cut off when the enemy overran part of the perimeter. The loading process took longer than planned as Marines helped their wounded comrades into the helicopter while under continuous fire. Several rounds penetrated the aircraft's thin skin, and Sarah felt the controls become sluggish as hydraulic fluid began leaking from damaged systems. Rodriguez called out warnings about multiple system failures, while continuing to engage enemy positions with his machine gun. During the loading, Sarah learned the full extent of the disaster that had befallen the Marine unit. The enemy had used the cover of darkness to infiltrate the Marine perimeter, turning the battle into a close-quarters fight where the Marines' advantages in training and equipment were minimized. Many Marines had been forced to fight hand-to-hand combat with bayonets and entrenching tools when their ammunition ran out. Williams pressed another piece of paper into Sarah's hand, this one containing intelligence information that the Marines had gathered about enemy positions and strength. He explained that even if the Marine unit was completely destroyed, this information could save other American lives by revealing the true scope of the enemy buildup in the region. The intelligence showed that the enemy force was actually part of a much larger operation planned to attack coalition bases throughout the area. As the last Marine climbed aboard, Sarah realized they were carrying 15 men this time instead of the planned 12. The additional weight would strain the damaged helicopter's systems and reduce their safety margins for the flight back to base. But looking at the faces of the young Marines crowded into her aircraft, she knew she could not leave anyone behind who had made it to the helicopter alive. The takeoff under fire became a nightmare of mechanical problems and enemy resistance. The helicopter struggled to lift off with the extra weight and battle damage, while enemy fighters concentrated their fire on the aircraft as it climbed slowly away from the landing zone. Rodriguez reported multiple system failures and warned that they might not have enough power to clear the surrounding mountains with their current load. Sarah pushed the helicopter beyond its design limits, using every technique she had learned in 8 years of flying to coax maximum performance from the damaged aircraft. The engine temperature gauges climbed into the red zone while hydraulic pressure continued to drop, but the aircraft continued to climb slowly away from the enemy fire. Behind them, the Marines who remained on the ground provided covering fire for as long as their ammunition lasted, buying precious seconds for the helicopter to escape. The flight back to base became a constant struggle against mechanical failures and fuel consumption. Rodriguez worked frantically to isolate damaged systems and maintain control of the aircraft, while Sarah fought with controls that became increasingly unresponsive. Several Marines in the passenger compartment were critically wounded and needed immediate medical attention, but the helicopter's medical equipment had been damaged by enemy fire. As they approached their base, Sarah made radio contact with the command center for the first time since beginning her unauthorized missions. Colonel Thompson's voice came through the speakers, demanding a full status report on both the aircraft condition and the situation at the Marine position. The tone in his voice suggested that he was preparing for the worst-case scenario, in which both the rescue mission and the trapped Marines would be lost. Sarah's response was brief and professional, reporting that she had successfully evacuated 27 Marines so far, but that more than 270 remained trapped and under attack. Her aircraft was severely damaged and would need extensive repairs before flying again, but she requested immediate preparation of backup aircraft to continue the rescue mission. The silence that followed her transmission suggested that no backup aircraft were available for such a dangerous mission. The helicopter landed at base with smoke pouring from the engine compartment and hydraulic fluid streaming from multiple punctures. As medical personnel rushed to treat the wounded Marines, Sarah climbed out of the cockpit knowing that her aircraft would never fly again. But somewhere in those distant mountains, hundreds of Marines were still fighting for their lives, and time was running out for any chance of saving them. The base erupted into frantic activity as word spread that Sarah's helicopter would never fly again, while hundreds of Marines remained trapped in enemy territory. Maintenance crews swarmed over every available aircraft, desperately trying to find anything capable of making the dangerous rescue flights. The harsh reality was that most helicopters were either committed to other critical missions or grounded for major maintenance that would take days to complete. Colonel Thompson faced an impossible decision as he stood in the command center, surrounded by maps, radio reports, and the faces of officers who knew they were about to abandon American soldiers to their fate. The last radio transmission from Williams had been 30 minutes earlier, reporting that his remaining Marines were down to bayonets and hand grenades. Enemy forces had breached the perimeter at multiple points, and the fighting had devolved into small, unit actions scattered across the rocky terrain. Sarah refused to accept defeat even as medical personnel tried to treat her for cuts and burns from her 2 combat flights. She studied every aircraft on the base, looking for anything that could carry passengers into the combat zone. Most of the helicopters were either too small for effective rescue operations or too large to land in the confined space around the Marine position. The few aircraft that might work were either damaged or assigned to missions that could not be postponed. A young maintenance sergeant named Jackson approached Sarah with an idea that bordered on insanity. He had been working on an old utility helicopter that was scheduled for retirement, trying to keep it operational for basic transport missions around the base. The aircraft was older and slower than Sarah's regular helicopter, with minimal armor protection and outdated navigation systems. But Jackson believed he could make it airworthy for one more mission. If Sarah was willing to fly an aircraft that might fall apart before reaching the Marines, Sarah examined the ancient helicopter. With growing desperation and determination, the aircraft showed its age in every component, with patches covering patches and systems that had been repaired so many times that the maintenance logs read like a history of creative engineering. But the engines were sound, the basic flight controls worked, and it had enough passenger space to carry 15 Marines per trip if they packed them in tightly. Rodriguez volunteered to fly the mission despite having no obligation to risk his life on an unauthorized operation using an aircraft that was barely airworthy. He had seen the faces of the wounded Marines they had already rescued, and understood that hundreds more were counting on them to return. Together, Sarah and Rodriguez began preparing the old helicopter while Jackson and his crew worked frantically to address the most critical mechanical issues. The radio reports from the Marine position had stopped completely, leaving everyone at the base to wonder whether Williams and his men were still alive, or if the position had finally been overrun. The silence was more terrifying than the desperate combat reports they had been receiving throughout the day. Without communications, they had no way to coordinate a landing or even determine if there were any Marines left to rescue. Colonel Thompson made a decision that would define his military legacy and possibly end his career. He authorized Sarah to take the old helicopter on as many rescue flights as necessary to evacuate the remaining Marines, knowing that he was sending her on what amounted to a suicide mission. His orders were clear and direct, telling her to continue rescue operations until either all Marines were evacuated or her aircraft was destroyed. As evening approached, Sarah and Rodriguez completed their pre-flight preparations on the aging helicopter. The aircraft carried maximum fuel but minimal equipment, with every unnecessary item removed to save weight for passengers. Jackson had installed additional radios and a basic medical kit, but the helicopter had no armor protection and limited defensive systems. They would be flying into enemy territory in an aircraft that was essentially defenseless against the heavy weapons now concentrated around the Marine position. The base personnel gathered to watch Sarah's third takeoff, understanding that they might never see her alive again. The old helicopter lifted off with a characteristic vibration that suggested mechanical problems. But Sarah managed to coax it into the air and turn toward the distant mountains where Marines were making their last stand. Behind her, the base fell silent as everyone focused on their duties while listening for radio updates from the rescue mission. The flight to the Marine position took longer in the slower aircraft, giving Sarah time to think about the tactical situation she was flying into. Without recent radio contact, she had no way of knowing where the enemy forces were positioned or whether the landing zones were still usable. The Marines might have been forced to abandon their original defensive positions, making it impossible to locate survivors even if any remained alive. As they approached the target area, Sarah and Rodriguez were shocked by the intensity of the ongoing battle. Despite the radio silence, the Marines were still fighting scattered actions across several square miles of mountainous terrain. Explosions and gunfire echoed through the valleys while flares and tracer rounds illuminated groups of Marines fighting desperate defensive actions from behind rocks and in small caves. Sarah realized that the original Marine unit had been broken up into small groups that were fighting independent battles across the rugged landscape. Some groups had managed to reach defensible positions in caves or among large rock formations, while others were trapped in the open and fighting mobile actions against superior enemy forces. The tactical situation was far more complex than a simple evacuation from a single landing zone. Rodriguez established radio contact with several Marine units using emergency frequencies, learning that Williams was still alive and coordinating the scattered defensive actions. The Marines had divided into groups of 10 to 20 men each, with the wounded and those low on ammunition moving toward rally points, while others provided covering fire. Williams estimated that about 280 Marines were still alive, scattered across 3 main defensive positions and several smaller groups. The enemy forces were systematically hunting down the Marine groups, using their superior numbers and heavy weapons to overwhelm each defensive position in turn. Sarah could see the tactical situation developing as enemy forces moved through the terrain, cutting off escape routes and concentrating fire on each Marine position until resistance collapsed. Time was running out for coordinated rescue operations. As the Marines became increasingly isolated and their ammunition supplies reached critical levels, Sarah made the difficult decision to attempt multiple landings in different locations, trying to evacuate Marines from each defensive position before the enemy could overrun them. This approach would require precise timing and incredible luck, as each landing would expose her aircraft to concentrated enemy fire while Marines ran across open ground to reach the helicopter. The old aircraft would have to perform far beyond its design specifications while under combat conditions that would challenge even the most modern military helicopter. As Sarah began her descent toward the first Marine position, she understood that the next few hours would determine whether hundreds of American soldiers lived or died in these remote mountains. The aging helicopter shuddered under the strain of combat maneuvering, while enemy fire erupted from positions that seemed to surround every possible landing site. The old helicopter descended through a storm of enemy fire toward the first Marine position, where Williams had managed to gather 37 survivors in a defensive formation among large boulders. Sarah fought to control the aircraft as bullets and shrapnel from rocket-propelled grenades filled the air around them. The ancient flight controls responded sluggishly to her inputs, and she could feel the aircraft vibrating ominously as enemy rounds found their mark on critical components. Rodriguez called out warnings about multiple system failures while returning fire with the door-mounted machine gun. The hydraulic system was failing completely, forcing Sarah to rely on manual controls that required tremendous physical strength to operate. The fuel gauges showed consumption rates far higher than planned due to the combat maneuvering and the aircraft's inefficient engines, threatening to leave them stranded in enemy territory without enough fuel to return to base. Williams appeared through the smoke and confusion, leading a group of Marines who carried their wounded comrades toward the helicopter. Several Marines had to be carried on improvised stretchers made from equipment and clothing, while others hobbled forward on their own despite serious injuries. Sarah watched in amazement as Marines who could barely walk themselves stopped to help others who were worse off, demonstrating the brotherhood that made military units willing to die for each other. The loading process under fire became a test of courage and endurance for everyone involved. Marines exposed themselves to enemy fire repeatedly as they carried wounded comrades to the helicopter, while others provided covering fire from whatever defensive positions they could find. Rodriguez had to reload his machine gun 3 times during the evacuation, burning through ammunition at an unsustainable rate while enemy fighters tried to rush the landing zone. Williams shouted over the noise that 2 more Marine groups were holding positions about a mile away in opposite directions. Each group had approximately 40 Marines, including many wounded who could not move without assistance. The enemy was closing in on both positions, and Williams estimated that they had perhaps 20 minutes before both groups would be overrun by superior numbers and firepower. Sarah made a calculation that violated every safety protocol she had ever learned. She loaded 41 Marines into a helicopter, designed to carry 20 passengers under normal conditions. The additional weight would make takeoff extremely dangerous and put enormous stress on the aging aircraft structure. But she could not bear to leave anyone behind who had fought their way to the helicopter. Several Marines had to stand throughout the flight, holding onto cargo straps while their wounded comrades lay on the floor. The takeoff with massive overload became a nightmare of mechanical stress and enemy fire. The helicopter struggled to lift off the ground while enemy fighters concentrated their fire on the slowly climbing aircraft. Sarah pulled maximum power from the engines, causing temperature gauges to climb dangerously into the red zone while the aircraft barely cleared the surrounding rocks and trees. The flight back to base with 41 Marines aboard pushed every system beyond its breaking point. Rodriguez monitored multiple warning lights and alarms while trying to keep the overloaded aircraft from shaking apart. Several Marines were unconscious from blood loss, while others fought to remain alert despite severe wounds that needed immediate medical attention. The helicopter's medical supplies had been exhausted after the first few evacuees, leaving the crew helpless to treat Marines who were dying before their eyes. Sarah radioed ahead to base with an urgent request for immediate medical support and rapid turnaround for her aircraft. She reported that approximately 80 Marines remained at two defensive positions that were under imminent threat of being overrun. The fuel situation was critical, and the aircraft would need rapid refueling and emergency repairs before attempting another mission. Every minute spent on the ground at base meant the remaining Marines had less chance of survival. The damaged helicopter limped back to base trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid while struggling to maintain altitude with its overload of passengers. Sarah had to use all her skill and experience to keep the aircraft flying, as multiple systems continued to fail throughout the flight. The Marines in the passenger compartment remained silent despite their pain, understanding that any distraction could cause the pilot to lose control of the barely flyable aircraft. Colonel Thompson was waiting on the landing pad as Sarah brought the helicopter in for what everyone hoped would not be its final landing. The aircraft touched down hard, causing additional structural damage, but all 41 Marines were successfully evacuated to waiting medical teams. Thompson immediately began coordinating emergency repairs and refueling, while Sarah refused medical treatment for herself, insisting that she needed to return for the remaining Marines before their positions were completely overrun. The maintenance crews worked with desperate efficiency to patch the most critical damage and refuel the helicopter. Jackson and his team used every repair technique they knew to keep the aging aircraft operational for at least one more flight. Several systems could not be repaired in the time available, meaning Sarah would have to fly the next mission with even more degraded capabilities and reduced safety margins. Radio contact was re-established with the remaining Marine positions, revealing that both groups were under sustained attack and running critically low on ammunition. Williams, who had stayed behind to coordinate the continuing defense, reported that enemy forces were using heavy mortars and had brought up additional anti-aircraft weapons specifically to prevent further rescue attempts. The tactical situation had deteriorated to the point where any helicopter attempting a landing would face almost certain destruction. Sarah studied the tactical maps one more time, trying to find any approach route that might give her a chance of reaching the Marines before their positions were overrun. The enemy had positioned their weapons to cover all possible landing zones, and their mortar fire was systematically destroying any location where a helicopter might touch down. But somewhere in those mountains, 80 young Americans were fighting for their lives and counting on her to come back for them. Rodriguez volunteered once again to fly the mission, despite the near certainty that they would not survive another trip into the heavily defended area. He had seen too many wounded Marines to abandon the mission now, regardless of the personal risk. Together, they began final preparations for what everyone understood would likely be their last flight. As Sarah climbed back into the pilot's seat of the battered helicopter, she thought about the piece of paper Williams had given her with the names and addresses of all the Marines. She had successfully evacuated 68 men so far, but the hardest part of the mission still lay ahead. The enemy would be waiting for her return, and the remaining Marines were in positions that were even more difficult to reach than the previous evacuation sites. The base fell silent as Sarah lifted off for her fourth unauthorized mission, with everyone understanding that they were watching either a rescue mission or a suicide flight. The helicopter climbed slowly into the darkening sky, heading toward mountains where desperate men waited for salvation that might never come. Behind her, Colonel Thompson stood watching from the command center, knowing that he had just authorized what could be the final chapter in both Sarah's heroic rescue effort and the tragic story of the trapped Marine unit. The fourth flight into the mountain battlefield became Sarah's ultimate test as a pilot and as a human being committed to leaving no one behind. The helicopter, now held together more by determination than mechanical integrity, struggled through the night air toward two Marine positions that were under final assault by overwhelming enemy forces. Rodriguez monitored systems that were failing faster than they could be compensated for, while Sarah fought controls that responded unpredictably to her inputs. The tactical situation had deteriorated dramatically during their brief time at base. Enemy forces had concentrated mortars and heavy machine guns around both remaining Marine positions, creating killing fields that any rescue helicopter would have to cross. Williams reported over the radio that his first group was down to hand grenades and bayonets, fighting enemy soldiers who had infiltrated their defensive perimeter under cover of Darkness. Sarah approached the first Marine position, using a flight path that took her directly through the heaviest concentration of enemy fire. There was simply no other way to reach the trapped Marines before they were completely overrun. The helicopter shuddered under the impact of multiple hits as enemy fighters opened up with everything they had, determined to prevent any further evacuations of American soldiers. The landing zone had been completely destroyed by mortar fire, forcing Sarah to hover the helicopter just above the rocky ground, while Marines climbed aboard under intense fire. Rodriguez provided covering fire with his machine gun until the weapon jammed from overheating, leaving the helicopter defenseless except for the suppressive fire provided by the Marines on the ground. Williams and his remaining 23 Marines fought their way to the aircraft while enemy soldiers pressed their attack from multiple directions, loading. The Marines under these conditions became a desperate struggle for survival. Several Marines were hit by enemy fire as they ran toward the helicopter, but their comrades refused to leave them behind. Sarah watched in horror and admiration as wounded Marines carried other wounded Marines to safety. Demonstrating courage that went beyond any military training or regulation, some Marines who were barely able to walk themselves took time to help others who were worse off. Williams was the last Marine to board the helicopter, providing covering fire until the final moment before jumping aboard the aircraft as Sarah began her takeoff. Enemy soldiers were close enough to throw grenades at the helicopter as it lifted off, and several explosions rocked the aircraft during its climb away from the landing zone. Rodriguez reported multiple new system failures, including complete loss of hydraulic assistance and damage to one of the main rotor blades. The flight to the second Marine position became a race against mechanical failure and fuel exhaustion. The helicopter vibrated violently from the damaged rotor blade while warning lights illuminated throughout the cockpit. Sarah had to use tremendous physical strength to control the aircraft manually while Rodriguez worked frantically to isolate damaged systems and maintain what little functionality remained. Radio contact with the second Marine group revealed that they were completely surrounded and under final assault. The group leader, Sergeant Martinez, reported that they had no ammunition left except for a few hand grenades and were fighting with entrenching tools and bayonets. Enemy forces were closing in from all sides, and Martinez estimated they had perhaps 10 minutes before their position would be completely overrun. Sarah pushed the failing helicopter beyond any reasonable operational limits as she raced to reach the second Marine position. The aircraft was losing altitude steadily due to the damaged rotor system, and she knew they would have only one chance to attempt a rescue before the helicopter became unflyable. The fuel gauges showed levels so low that a return flight to base would be impossible even under the best circumstances. The approach to the second Marine position took Sarah through a gauntlet of enemy fire that seemed impossible to survive. Anti-aircraft guns and shoulder-fired missiles filled the air around the helicopter while mortar rounds exploded, close enough to flip the aircraft if Sarah had not been constantly maneuvering to avoid the worst of the fire. The helicopter took hit after hit, with systems failing faster than Rodriguez could compensate for them. Sarah managed to reach the Marine position just as enemy soldiers were beginning their final assault on the surrounded Americans. She brought the helicopter down in a controlled crash landing that destroyed the landing gear but kept the aircraft upright and operational. Sergeant Martinez and his 37 Marines fought their way to the helicopter while enemy soldiers pressed their attack from less than 50 meters away. The loading of the final Marines took place under the most intense combat conditions any of them had ever experienced. Enemy soldiers were close enough that Marines had to fight hand-to-hand combat, while their wounded comrades were being loaded into the helicopter. Rodriguez had abandoned his jammed machine gun and was now fighting with his sidearm while helping Marines climb aboard the damaged aircraft. Sarah attempted takeoff with 60 Marines aboard a helicopter that was never designed to carry more than 20 passengers. The aircraft struggled to lift off with the massive overload and extensive battle damage, barely clearing the ground as enemy soldiers ran toward them firing automatic weapons. Several Marines fell out of the open doors during the takeoff, forcing others to grab them and pull them back inside, while the helicopter climbed slowly away from the battlefield. The return flight to base became a testament to the power of human determination over mechanical impossibility. The helicopter should have crashed within minutes of takeoff, But Sarah's skill and the collective will of 60 Marines somehow kept it flying through the mountain valleys. Rodriguez called out constant warnings about system failures, while Marines in the passenger compartment worked together to treat wounded comrades with improvised medical supplies. As the base came into view, Sarah realized that the helicopter would never make it to the landing pad. The aircraft was losing altitude rapidly and would crash short of the runway unless she found a way to extend their glide. She aimed for an open field near the base perimeter, hoping to crash land close enough that ground vehicles could reach the Marines quickly. The final landing became a controlled crash that destroyed the helicopter but saved the lives of all 60 Marines aboard. The aircraft hit the ground hard and slid across the field before coming to rest against a fence line, but the passenger compartment remained intact. Emergency vehicles raced toward the crash site as Marines helped each other evacuate the wreckage of the aircraft that had saved their lives. Rye and Rodriguez were pulled from the cockpit of their destroyed helicopter, with serious but not life-threatening injuries. As medical personnel treated their wounds, they watched 60 more Marines being loaded into ambulances and transported to medical facilities where they would receive the treatment needed to save their lives. Behind them, the smoking wreckage of their aircraft stood as a monument to courage and determination that had saved 340 American lives. Colonel Thompson arrived at the crash site to find Sarah conscious but exhausted from her ordeal. She handed him the piece of paper that Williams had given her with the names and addresses of all the Marines, now with a notation that every single name had been successfully evacuated. For the first time in her military career, Sarah had completed a mission that everyone had said was impossible, bringing home every Marine who had been trapped in those deadly mountains. The rescue operation, that had begun as one woman's unauthorized decision to violate military regulations, had ended with the successful evacuation of an entire Marine unit from certain death. Sarah's courage in breaking every rule to save lives had inspired others to join her effort, creating a chain of heroic actions that proved the power of individual determination to change impossible situations. The story of the Marine rescue would be told for generations as an example of what could be accomplished when people refused to abandon their fellow soldiers, regardless of the personal cost or official regulations that stood in their way.